Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest Tyson Yunkaporta, and he's here today to share with us his new book, Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. Now, Tyson is an academic, art critic, and a researcher who's a member of the Apalak clan in far north Queensland. He carves traditional tools and weapons and also is a senior lecturer in Indigenous knowledges at Deakin University in Melbourne. Today, we're so lucky to have Tyson joining us all the way from Melbourne. So let's welcome to the show, Tyson Yunkaporta.
Hey, good to be here. Nice to have a moment with you.
You know, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. My goodness, I picked it up. I could not put it down. I really think this book is very profound. And gosh, don't we need a book like this right now?
Yeah, like whoever we is. But I
humanity.
That's what I redefine in the book. I guess I'm, without really saying it out loud, it's who are we? And it's we are the custodians of creation. We're the custodial species on this planet. So I guess that's a good, nice new collective we to think about.
I like looking at it that way because, we are custodians and, we're supposed to be here caring about each other too. I think there's much more community that should be involved than what people usually think.
Yeah. So I guess there is the big collective we, and then there's sort of exclusive groups of we, isn't there? Each of us is in our own little, exclusive groups that unfortunately can become echo chambers if we're not careful. And and then I guess there's the smaller we, which is you and me right now, us two having a moment together, So I talk about those different kinds of we in the book and how in our Aboriginal languages we have different words for we, and we have a different word for each of those three. So we've got, this us two here right now, and then we've got our us but not them, in our exclusive groups, but then we have the bigger, broader we, us all. And I think they're useful pronouns we could probably introduce into English. Hey. Us.
Well, I think it would be about time if we did, because there's so much language that can be very exclusive. And it's interesting when we look at, Indigenous thinking, how it's completely the opposite.
Mm. Yeah, well, in our way, it's very much, we don't have a word for nature or a word for society, so we don't have those two things separated. It's one thing, We couldn't even say we're part of nature because we wouldn't be able to separate enough to be able to even imagine not being, so we wouldn't have to say it in the first place, But everything in nature and in complex dynamic systems, there's not one particle in any of those systems that is isolated, that is just in and of itself, individual. And our old people will tell you, everything is two, everything is connected in a pair to something else, but not just one pair. You're one particle in this system and you're connected out to many, many different pairs. And quantum physicists will tell you the same thing, that nothing exists in isolation to be observed. It's always a pair. So if you're observing a particle, then you're a pair with that particle. There's the particle and the observer, and that's one thing, And I think that's a really good way to be able to connect with the reality that we belong to, there's some really good intersections, I guess, between Indigenous knowledge, at that level, and the global knowledge of global systems, that we need to be engaging with in complex ways, if we want to find some complex solutions. And I guess that's the crux of the book, is grappling with those things and trying to figure out what sustainability actually means. because that is a brand that has been has been just bastardized beyond recognition. Sustainability.
Well, it seems like it's a word that's thrown out so much in many regards, but when you get to the basis of what sustainability is to maybe what a civilization thinks versus what indigenous people think, it's very different.
Yeah, and then I mean, just what any human being that can step outside of this illusory framework that we've all been indoctrinated into. I mean, all of us, we've all been sucked into this wrong story of reality, and anybody who can step outside of that just for a minute, not even outside of it, but just have a look around, with a different lens on for a moment and see what's going on around them. I think that's when you've got to start going, hang on a minute, what do you mean double the population of this city sustainably in the next 10 years? Well, you just chuck that word sustainably in there and it sort of sanitizes it, makes it all right. That's just not doable, folks. Yeah. I think, we've sort of, we've all been sucked into this wrong story of reality. So even, as Indigenous people, we define ourselves as Indigenous, but in relation to this other, we still define ourselves in relation to this illusory system, separating ourselves out as, oh, we're the Indigenous people over here. And we define ourselves, every trait of Indigenousness that we use to define ourselves is just in opposition. It's just basically saying what we're not. Well, we don't have centralized governance. We're not a print-based culture. We're not linear thinkers. And so all the words we use to describe ourselves is just saying what we're not in relation to the globalizing system, which is a bad way, not a good basis for a person's identity at all, to basically be. In the meantime, the dominant culture is basically standing in the center and looking outwards to the margins and saying, well, we're not that. So it's almost everybody in the world is just defining themselves by what they're not rather than what they are. And it's a really interesting exercise to sit down for a minute and connect with the place where you are with the landscape and think to yourself and call out to the ancestors and all the entities in the lands and skies and everything else and wonder for a moment, well, what am I? What are we? Jesus, what are we? It's nice to take a moment to do that, don't you think?
I agree with you 100%. I mean, if you really kind of just stop for a minute and really think about just the deep connection we have with each other and what we really are, I think that really provides a lot of, just kind of being in the moment and just thinking about, gosh, where's my place in the universe? How do I fit into all of this? Yeah. And if so, how am I participating and how can I be better at that?
Yeah. And I mean, a good place to start is just your self-definition. It's not to be looking out to the people that you disagree with or don't like and define your whole consciousness as, well, I think, therefore I am not like those idiots over there. Yeah.
I don't know. I find myself looking out to the stars when I have these types of thoughts, and it seems a little grounding to me in some way to be able to have that kind of connection and be able to go, okay, in the bigger picture, where am I with all this,
And then I guess the stars, the sky is something we all have in common. And I speak about this a lot in the book that we have, there are constellations that have the same name and similar story all around the globe, which, I mean, it doesn't fit with any of our stories, our contemporary stories of what human history really is and where we all came from. Because we're all looking at the Pleiades constellation, and all around the world it's called the Seven Sisters. There's not even 7 stars in that constellation. There's heaps more than that. But for some reason, everybody's looking at those stars and going 7 and calling them sisters. Everybody's looking at Aquila, that constellation, and going, yeah, that's an eagle. It doesn't look anything like an eagle. Everybody's looking at Orion and going, yeah, that's a hunter or a warrior. And it's just a kind of a square in the sky, but everybody's seeing that same hunter or warrior. You know, we have these star maps, and we have a common origin story and set of stories. There is a mythos that binds us all together. And, you know, I find that very exciting. You know, this idea that we've all come out from a very strong common ancestral culture that's inscribed in the maps in the sky, which also reflect, you know, the maps in our landscape. But then our landscape itself, the land is a map that is projected into your inner worlds. I mean, you can't think or remember anything without the parts of your brain that are used for navigation. You know, so here's, I guess, where you start to get into the cognitive science and the neural science, and it's very interesting. You know, it's basically it's narrative and spatial awareness. So mapping and stories, but having stories mapped onto an inner landscape that's reflected in the world around you. That's how human cognition occurs, and that's where your consciousness lies. That's where your mind is. Your mind is in this dynamic interaction between you and this landscape, to the point that it's hard to separate the two. You know, you move through your landscape, but it happens internally in your mind and externally in the way you move through it. Every bit of knowledge you have is actually on maps inside your mind, and that's for every human being. And I find that very exciting, because you can't even think without that. So, yeah. So if you look into that, you know, embodiment, if you look at distributed cognition, haptic cognition, all these different areas of cognitive science, and look at the research that's been done there, you start to realize, oh yeah, my mind is not just contained within my skull. And yes, it is throughout my body, but then there's no real start and finish to where my body, you know, begins and ends. We have this haptic relation where if we pick up a stick, our mind recognizes that stick as an extension of our arm in our interaction with that. But then it doesn't even have to be kinesthetic in that way. You know, if you're placing yourself in relation to an object that you see over there, then that becomes an extension of your neural processes. If you're looking up at that constellation in the sky, that also becomes an extension of your neural processes. So your mind itself is potentially, you know, infinite where distance is nothing, you know. And I guess this is something that's very well known to Indigenous cultures, and it's how we move through our lives. And it's how we interact, and it's how we form and manage our communities and our social structures and everything else, our governance, our ways of thinking, everything else, all comes under this understanding. But these are understandings that, you know, they're out there in the modern world as well. It's just a matter of bringing them together, bringing all those different elements together and starting to see a pattern of what your mind is, of what creation is, and understanding how those things align. And then going forward out into the world like that, with a sort of a collective, distributed understanding of what consciousness is. And then us two, us only, and us all, you know, can start moving as we're supposed to move within a complex adaptive system. and allow this emergence, this idea that comes out of complexity theory, this emergence to start to occur, whereby the system can stabilize and become something that is truly sustainable. Yeah. So it's complex ideas, isn't it? It's it takes a while to explain them.
Well, and what started you even being interested in this? Because it's interesting when you speak about this, and just you relate it also with Indigenous thinking. It seems that every show that you see nowadays on the History Channel or any of these documentaries, they're actually kind of wrapping back around to Indigenous thinking, going, oh gosh, well, they've known this for thousands of years and science is just figuring this out.
Yeah, and that's a nice thing, but that idea is just always, co-opted into support of that. Like it's always just tokenistic, and it's co-opted into just branding, with different political ideologies going, yes, this culture is actually quite sophisticated, therefore, the mainstream culture isn't the be all and end all in the center of the universe. And then the other group going, no, those people are primitive and stupid and live fact checked, and there was an error here, so therefore the whole thing is. And then they just go backwards and forwards in debates, and then they start attacking each other, personally, and usually at that level of branding, whether the branding's correct or incorrect, or it's that culture wars idea, and so these things come in as lower order thinking and basic just sort of facts at the information level, and just uses ammunition in these culture wars that gets fired back and forth. But I think we need to go a little bit deeper. If we see Indigenous cultures as living cultures and of ways of thinking and being that are intensely adaptive, in very long-lived cultures that have been through all kinds of massive periods of climate change and all kinds of natural disasters and every disaster you can imagine. If you look at those cultures as having a pattern and a way of being that is adaptive, and that, a lot of those patterns and a lot of those processes are things that are transferable, things that you could actually, they're generalizable, that can be taken on as a pattern, not just grab a dream catcher and hang it on your wall, not just, I'm going to buy a feather fan from the New Age shop and I'm going to do some Indian shaman stuff. It's like, no, just leave that stuff alone. That's just the material culture. That's on the surface, You can come to the patterns of things and to the processes of knowledge, rather than just the material outputs of that knowledge. And it's in those processes and patterns and ways of being. That's where the answers lie.
Wow, that's so impressive. I mean, because you really get to the point where, for me, when I look at Indigenous cultures, I believe that that's where the wisdom of humanity is. I look at it as a jewel. And I think if most people view it that way, there's so much to be gained and so much that can be learned by, Indigenous thinking.
Yeah, and I think one of the big, we're in the middle of, we've been in struggles, like big struggles for like at least 5 decades. And those big struggles have been around, what can we, so we're living in an economic system and a social system that is based on the idea of infinite growth. That's what civilizations do. And that's the pattern. It has to be infinite growth. If it stops growing, it dies. And we're all living in that system, and we're all struggling back and forth with the ideas of how we're going to brand that system. Do we want to make that system look a little bit more fair than it is for everyone? Which is impossible, by the way. But, do we want to airbrush it a bit to make it look like it's more fair? Or do we want to
That's a good way of putting it.
blatantly be unfair? But the fact is that the system can't be fair. It's not a complex dynamic system. because in a complex dynamic system, everything is distributed. And this is not a complex dynamic system. It's a complicated, tinkered system, which is, constantly needs hands-on in order to stop the natural flow of things that happen in a system, and to, create these little monopolies and all that sort of thing in the interests of a few people, So you can't walk around and say, well, let's just make sure that, the board of directors for this monopoly, has a couple of different colored faces on it, and then the system will be fair. So we struggle around that. Just as an example, the prison industrial complex, in the United States, that's a very, very important part of the economy, and it has been for a long time. The prison industrial complex, is a way of making money off certain, marginalized segments of the community, making big money, like just bigger than you can even imagine. And if that suddenly disappeared and went away overnight, the entire, what's left of the economy there would just completely collapse. So, I mean, if Black lives actually mattered, the prison industrial complex would collapse overnight. So, basically, in order to keep your economy going, and therefore the entire global economy, it is not possible to have a reality where Black lives matter. What you can do is tweak things a bit and make things look better, and you can have, Bezos can stand up and say, yeah, Black lives matter, pick up that box, boy, and I don't care if you got COVID, move it over there. It's, people can brand. It's the same as using the word sustainability to throw it into some horrendous thing that's going to poison a lake. We're going to sustainably poison this lake. It's the same thing. You can't airbrush this system. Civilized systems are not sustainable, and they're not fair, and they're horrendous. And that needs to end. We need to move into a very different game. And there are a lot of people in the world right now who are, working towards all different kinds of governance systems, software, platforms, all kinds of things that are trying to decentralize, these systems, and trying to, figure out how to get things back to complexity, get things back to communities, lots of diverse communities, sort of syndicated together, a kind of peer-to-peer network of being, which is the way that has always been, throughout human history. And basically just try and get past this little civilized blip, which is only about 10,000 years old, which is the last 5 minutes in our human history. So, people are trying to figure, and that doesn't mean that we all have to go back to making tools out of rocks and, eating earthworms or whatever people's image is of a primitive past. It doesn't mean we're all running around naked or anything, but it does mean that we're organizing our human social systems in a way that brings that back into a symbiosis with nature, and in a way that's operating in peer-to-peer networks, not just amongst humans. Well, yes, initially just peer-to-peer amongst humans, but hopefully the idea is that will spread out to human and non-human relations, that we will all form these pairs with non-human entities in the world around us, and actually start to become embedded in our reality again, and start to operate as a complex system, rather than this complicated, tinkered, doomed, monolithic juggernaut that we've all been swept up in.
I could not agree with you more, Tyson. I think this is a perfect time for change. The planet, people, everyone is crying out for change at this time. And it's something that we can make if we put our best minds together and start moving forward. Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. We've been speaking with Tyson Yunkaporta in regards to his new book, Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, when you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 123 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with our special guest, Tyson Yunkaporta, and he's sharing with us his new book, Sand Talk: How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. Now, Tyson, before we went for break, we were talking about just the changes that need to take place and how we may be in different boats, but we're definitely in the same storm. That we're all kind of headed to the same kind of shipwreck island in a way if we don't get things right and fix things. And you had a really brilliant video. It's a really, a short, easy video that talks about your book. And in it, you talked about how we're all refugees from nature. And that really hit home for me because isn't that the truth? I mean, how detached are we from nature?
Yeah. Well, and you look at how sick any entity becomes when its habitat becomes violently disrupted and it has to start moving and finding another place to be, another way to be. There are pathologies that happen, so a bat fleeing from an ecosystem where the plants have stopped flowering, because of the massive amount of toxic radioactive waste that's around the place, and 1,000 other things. A bat that's fleeing from a place where the plants have stopped flowering, it's trying to mutate in ways to adapt, to its new habitat. But that's in flux. That system hasn't settled yet. So it's adapting, to a context that doesn't exist yet and is still in flux. So you've got these little viruses that are supposed to help us do that. Viruses help you change at the cellular level. And when everything is in balance, those viruses are good and they help you to be constantly adapting to a landscape that's sort of steadily, constantly changing. But when it's in this state of violent flux and just destruction, and there's nowhere to go and there's nowhere to be, those things mutate in very just violent ways, and so that bat will suddenly become, pathological. It will become very sick, and those viruses are mutating and mutating. And then, they're mutating so fast that they'll cross to other species, and then we have problems. So this sickness, global sickness that we're experiencing now, it's a comorbidity that's coming out of a very sick environment, where there's only 20% of the world's habitat remaining at the moment. And that 20% is in dire distress because it's all these little pockets of, what people are calling wilderness that is isolated and unable to exchange uncontaminated matter and energy with other natural systems. All these natural systems are supposed to be linked, and there's supposed to be a free flow of energy and matter around, among, and between those systems. And that's no longer occurring. So you've got these lovely wilderness areas on 20% of the world's surface, but they're these little islands of death. They've become these sort of enclosed spaces, these closed systems that are entropic and just falling apart. So yeah, we're in a lot of dire trouble at the moment, and it's more than just one thing. It's more than climate change, anthropogenic climate change. It's more than just the pollution. It's so many different things. And I think the idea of separating these things into different categories and silos, with various abstract nouns, and then addressing each one one at a time and individually, depending on what your brand is that's not going to get us there. Not at all. We've even separated the ideas of weather and climate, which is just outrageous to me. The idea that what is the difference between weather and climate? The only difference is that we've created this construct of climate as something that can be, it's like comes under this kind of neoliberal McDonaldization of all natural systems and systems that should be natural, even like economies, but we sit here and we go, yeah, okay, so there's this thing called climate, and it's something that we can collect data on and metrics, and we can measure it, and we can make predictions, and we can, scale all our responses and all these sorts of things, and we can try and control it, and I'm sorry, but that's just the weather, and that's not something you can tinker with, and not something you can control, and it's not something you can domesticate, the same as any other complex system on this planet. It can't be domesticated. You're not going to be able to do it, because if you don't move with the land will move you. Yeah.
Well, and you talk about how we're these islands, and it's basically we've become these islands of consumption, and to kind of get back, they talk about, oh, we're going to go ahead and maybe recycle here and take care of things there, but there's still islands of consumption, and we're really kind of just destroying the environment, that we live in. So one city may have good air, but 100 miles away, they're, packed in smog. And it's not making any sense. This is all part of the same planet.
Yeah. If you're if you're living in an area that has a vaguely sort of livable habitat, that probably means that you're outsourcing the destruction of habitat to somewhere else. That's all that means. You're shipping your waste and your toxins and to somewhere else, and you're extracting any of the value and goodness and fertility, from that other place and bringing it into your place. And then you're thinking you're living in this this environment that can sustain life, but you're not, because the clock's running out on that. Even just separating things out, into this concept of the environment. It's like, what's the environment? That's your habitat. And your habitat is you. You are it. It's not something that's separate from you and over there. You're in a habitat, and that habitat necessarily connects up, with many other habitats and exchanges energy and matter with those habitats. So, be careful. Start to see yourself within these systems, and you need to start to act as an agent within a complex system. Or pretty much, yeah, you're just living in this illusory bubble, which is going to pop. Most of the world's on fire right now. And if your world isn't, then it will be soon.
I think a lot of people, and it's interesting because I think, when we look at language has really separated us from, our habitat, from each other. And when we look at things, through the lens of, how Indigenous people think, I think it really brings us back to, being part of something bigger.
I mean, there was a language. I mean, the Angles were a people who were experiencing some quite a bit of flooding and a lot of trouble in their landscape. Also depleted soils from the, incursions of intensive agriculture and stuff like that. And so they had to move out to other places, like England, for example. I mean, but their culture was a beautiful culture, and it was a connected culture. And I think personally, if you went back in time and you brought an Angle now and showed him what Anglo culture is now, this global Anglosphere, I think he would be horrified, or she would be horrified at what they saw. Like, that's not our culture. And this language now that's developed, this English, that everyone in the world has to speak if they want to be involved in anything at all. This language that's evolved is basically a trade Creole that is placeless, and it doesn't belong anywhere. So it's separated from a landscape. And I think, I don't know, we won't go into it too much, but you really need to look into who the hell John Cecil Rhodes was, because there aren't very many people in the modern world who've had entire countries named after them. But he did. I mean, it's not called Rhodesia anymore. It's called Zimbabwe now. But that was named after him. And he was the most wealthy man on the planet in his time. And he didn't have any heirs. So he, are you aware of this? He willed his entire fortune to the development of Anglo culture and Anglo dominance around the globe. And
wow.
His estate is still there. The Rhodes Foundation, you've probably heard of Rhodes scholarships. Mm-hmm. And you've heard of these round table groups, these sort of think tanks. Anytime you hear a think tank referring to round tables, that's funded out of this Rhodes Foundation, which is just unspeakable wealth in this foundation that has all been put into the project of global Anglo dominance, and it's quite a terrifying thing. I think if anybody's looking for anything, people are always looking for these conspiracy theories, but you don't have to look very far, and you don't have to imagine groups of people sitting somewhere and plotting to destroy the world. That was a dead man switch that was set in motion, a long time ago. Basically, if you wanted to change this global system, then you'd need to start by taking out that foundation and seizing its assets and distributing those in ways that are going to go towards an actual livable future. Because at the moment, it's just some psychotic English man's idea of completely plundering the Southern Hemisphere in order to expand the influence of England throughout the globe, which is arguably not a vision that anybody's particularly interested in anymore. but that mechanism is still in place. So I guess this is what an Indigenous lens on the world that's grounded in this complexity thinking can give you. It can allow you to see what the foundation of problems are. Because every bit of new knowledge, before it's allowed into our Indigenous knowledge systems, it has to be interrogated in terms of, well, what is the core truth of that knowledge? What is the foundational story of that knowledge? And, is that something that aligns with our values? And then we can bring it into our knowledge system. So, of course, whenever we look at new knowledge, if I'm looking at the world and looking at the global system that's scabbed over our Earth at the moment, then I will see this Anglosphere, and then I will want to track back to find where that, what is the mechanism that's making that happen? This, completely cooked, out of date historical idea that's a pattern that's continuing through the world. And I believe that one of the mechanisms, the fundamental mechanisms that's making that happen, is this legacy of John Cecil Rhodes.
I knew nothing about that, but I'm going to be checking that out for sure.
Yeah.
That's completely horrifying, because you look at that, it just seems that it's so out of touch, and it's so just not a way that we want to be more inclusive in having people at the table, having discussions and how we move forward. Because, do you feel like from an Indigenous standpoint that at some point we have to come together to fix what's happening? What are your thoughts on how we move forward from all this?
Yeah, well, there's a problem in the way that groups are organizing. There are a lot of little splintered groups everywhere trying to organize around solving these problems, and there have been for decades, but there's always it's just a mechanism that's been installed, in liberalism that pretty much it does amazing things. Liberalism has an incredible design. It can absorb any revolutionary idea and keep the name of it, but then turn it around to its own ends. Like even liberalism itself had come out of this idea of liberty, of freedom, people trying to take back this more distributed way of governing and being in the world. And it just kept the name liberty, and then that became liberalism. And but liberalism itself, it was still the same old feudal oppressive system, and it just keeps spinning its way out in that pattern into the world. So it has that quality, but it also has the quality of being able to divide any groups that begin to organize effectively against it. And it's very simple. So just you look at any green movement over the last decade, and you'll see that all of them have ended up experiencing a hard fork, have ended up splintering and splitting and dividing and spending all their time infighting. And it's, in recent years, that's been a very easy one. It's just been about the issue of trans identities and definitions of what gender is. So, you can have a group that's dedicated to try and save a forest, and they'll end up arguing for 6 months over, whether sex is gender or gender is sex, and very violently, divide and become ineffective. So you basically find all these groups branding, and there's this idea where, your story, so you can come with a good story, and then suddenly, though, you want it to become an ideology, and good story becomes a bad story and becomes an ideology when people say, everybody should think like this, everybody should believe this. And then, so they start to struggle to make sure that their story has dominance. And so you end up with just, and then, they bring like-minded people together and they come in that group, and then everybody starts to struggle within, around these little bits of dogma. and they start to police each other within their little groups, and they start to do purity testing and all kinds of lateral violence to, police each other's speech and everything else. And all these groups just sort of shatter themselves apart. It's amazing to watch. But then also, I think that in the last 3 years, a really interesting pattern I've seen has emerged, and that's the art of the deal.
Oh boy!
So not everybody has read Trump's book, but everybody on the planet has done the workshop. In the last few years.
Oh
and
no!
There is one key message that comes out of the art of the deal. It's when you're negotiating, you have to act absolutely crazy. You have to ask for really impossible, ridiculous things. That's what you've got to go in asking for. But not just one impossible, ridiculous things, many. You have to assert them absolutely with the threat that you are going to wreck the joint if you don't get all of them. And you have to make sure that those demands contradict each other and are impossible together anyway. They've got to make no sense, and they've got to be absolutely insane. And then he says this in his book. You act absolutely crazy and ask for impossible things. And then all of a sudden, you calm down and put on the table the original sane offer of what you were going to ask for. And everybody is so relieved that they take the deal. Now, that's the art of the deal. And that, we've all been through that workshop. And we're all doing that now. And that is how we're interacting. That's how we're communicating with each other, down to the basic level of everything. That's how we're interacting with our children.
Well, I hope not. That's horrible.
I want my little baby daughter to not take her nappy off and throw it around the room, So I catch myself just saying these insane things. You leave that on, or I'm going to throw you out the door, like as if I'm actually going to, And I'm like, wow, I've had heaps of kids, and I've been a foster parent for decades, and I've raised so many babies, but I've never spoken to a child like that. What the hell's going on with me? I find it's in our relationship. So, partners, marriage partners together, as every argument is bringing all or nothing to the table with insane, hyperbolic rhetoric. I see everybody talking like this. I see people on the news talking like this. I see people online talking. This is how communication happens now. I actually watched some Fox News last night because I've never seen Fox News before, but I pride myself on trying to listen to everybody. So I thought I'd better watch some of that. And I watched 5 minutes and I had to stop because I loved it so much. It was so enticing and satisfying. Basically, it's like, this just in. Jeffrey Epstein is waiting for Ghislaine Maxwell in hell. Like, they actually said that. And I'm like, that's the most satisfying bit of news I've ever heard. And it made me feel really good. And I wanted to see more. And then I thought, oh my God, it's 5 minutes. They got me already. I'm going to have to turn this off. I mean, I want to listen to them, but I'm worried about my holding any kind of thought integrity together if I do.
Yeah,
everybody's insane at the moment. Everybody's done the workshop, and even if they haven't read the book, and everybody's enacting that pattern. And if you throw that in with the weird patterns of liberalism that I said before, any kind of resistance groups and ways of, ideas of us coming together in groups to somehow defeat this invisible end. Where is it? Where's this invisible end? I don't know. We're going to come together in these groups and we're going to defeat that. But first, I want to defeat everybody else in my group and make sure that I'm the boss of it and my story is on top. So I'm going to police everyone in that. It's just chaos, and not good chaos like chaos theory chaos. No. There's nothing complex about this. It's just a system that's breaking down, and each of us is a particle in that system that's just completely cut off from every other particle. And so we've got entropy in the extreme. So we need to start reconnecting, in our relationships and roles of how we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to interact, And that's, I talk about those basic operating protocols of any element in a complex adaptive system, from complexity theory. And I show the way this aligns with indigenous logics and knowledge, even indigenous languages. You can see that same pattern there. And I say it's basically just these 4 operating protocols. And if you can get yourself operating, along the lines of those operating protocols, and they're very broad and they're easy to do, then you might be able to, start introducing a new natural, decent pattern back into this system and start to try and come towards some kind of homeostasis in the systems in which you live.
Well, I don't think that's that tall of an order. I think your book kind of outlines where people can at least start. And I'd love for you to, I know you mentioned it, but I'd love for you to share with us what those 4 principles are.
Diversity is one of them, but that's another word like sustainability that's been co-opted. Diversity isn't, having a couple of different genders and colored faces on your board of directors. You know what I mean? That's not what diversity is. The diversity principle in complexity theory is that you need to interact with other agents or nodes in the system that are dissimilar from you. You have to interact with nodes that are very different from you. So the pairs that you form have to be with things that are almost opposite from you. But not only that, in your exclusive groups, you have to try and maintain your individuality in that group. You have to make sure that you're different as possible from the nodes that are most similar to you. So you can't cluster in these like-minded groups and just take comfort from each other being all the same. If you do that, you get stagnation. So diversity means, asserting your individuality, basically. Now, obviously, in a system, if that was the only operating protocol you were following, then you'd end up with rampant, rugged individualism, and everything would fall apart anyway. So the other principles kind of balance that out. So you have interaction, which is another principle. So you've got diversity and you've got interaction. You need to be interacting with as many different nodes as you can in that system. And you need to be exchanging energy and matter and resources with as many different nodes as you can. And in that means that you can't gather things to you, like gather knowledge and hold it jealously and go, IPRs, and that's my knowledge because I'm Dr. Such and such. You need to be spreading and sharing your knowledge as much as possible. Sharing information that needs to be open, flowing openly. And so economies work like that too, So the amount of dollars in a system is not as important as the velocity of each of those dollars within the system. Does that make sense?
It does.
So it's not about growing the size of. It's not about quantitative easing. You need qualitative easing. So rather than growing the amount of dollars you have in your economic system, you have to have the velocity that each dollar has to exchange hands with as many different nodes as possible. Then you'll have a healthy economy. So there's that principle of interaction. Also connection, I guess, which precedes that. It's connecting, having as many combinatorials as you can. So the indigenous concept of increase is very different from the non-indigenous idea of growth. Growth is about growing the size of the system. Increase is about growing the connections within that system. So if you've got a system with 1,000 nodes in it, there are a billion different combinatorials of 3 within that system, and infinitely more pairs. So you need to make sure you're making those pairs, those little us-twos, as many as possible in that. So that's that that interaction protocol and the connection protocol. So you've got diversity, interaction, and connection. And the last one is really important, because if you're doing the first three properly, then that last protocol of adaptation should take place. You have to allow all of these interactions to change you, to transform you constantly. And that's the hardest thing for people, because we're all little mini corporations unto ourselves. We've swallowed the pattern of neoliberalism, hook, line, and sinker. Each of us is a little corporation that must brand itself, and we're forced to be like futures traders, trading our own individual futures, building our personal brand, and burning our relationships to do it. Using our relationships and all of our resources as capital to leverage, trading, we're speculating on our futures, with all of these things we can gather around ourselves and these little brands that we can build up, or that are basically just a series of consumer choices. It's terrible. And that's it. So you're directing all of your capital into static heaps. Every single individual on the planet is doing that, let alone corporations. And you can't be doing that. You can't be freezing yourself and going, this is brand me. You need to be constantly adapting, constantly changing. You have to allow that free flow of energy and information from all the infinite pairs you're connected to, to move through you and change you as it goes through. Even when you're watching Fox News.
Well, maybe especially when you're watching Fox News, right?
Yeah, but that's the thing of diversity. If you're only watching Fox News, then you're just going to get radicalized to one way. You've got to make sure that you're allowing yourself to be radicalized in a million different facets, right across the political spectrum. Which is more of a Have you ever come across that the political continuum test? Like it's this kind of little survey tool that you fill out online, and it shows you where you are on this political continuum.
No, I have not.
It's not a straight line from left to right. It's one of those big X sort of like a plus sign shape. I don't know what they call that kind of graph. I've forgotten for some reason. But anyway, so there's an up and a down and a left to a right. And you end up on this grid placing yourself. I did that test recently. And apparently I'm I'm an extreme left libertarian.
That's where they categorized you, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I'm going to take that test in another 2 weeks, and I bet I end up in another place on there, because I am, constantly in this state of adaptation, and I'm allowing myself to be transformed, by all the stories that I interact with and all the yarns that I have. I mean, I'm talking, by the end of this interview here, I'm talking very differently. Just from interacting with you, I'm speaking very differently to the way that I was speaking this morning. I've already been changed a little bit from my moment with you here.
You are so good. My goodness, and I have to say I've done the same. Well, I feel the same. I mean, this discussion has really brought an expansion for me that I'm looking at going, you know what? We're going to have another conversation before you know it, because it's more than just, it's a broader sense of thinking that I believe that most people don't really have the opportunity or even, perception to dive into. And, we need to have these broader discussions, the wee.
Yeah.
So.
Well, they're easier to have because if you're speaking from that higher knowledge, if you're looking at the patterns of the knowledge rather than just, arguing over snippets of information, it's less emotional. Like you're not getting engaged at the base level of emotions. You're engaging with your mind, rather than just your little bit of monkey brain or something, lizard brain, even. You're engaging, your entire mind at once. And when you do that, it's kind of stable. I talk to all kinds of people who say terrible things, and I find myself quite calm about it. And I find them quite calm about it too when I'm drawing out their higher order thinking and knowledge.
Oh my goodness, Tyson. I mean, we can talk all day and all night here. You're such an inspiration. So Tyson, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for the moments. It's been lovely.
Well, it has been such an honor to spend this moment with you, Tyson. Thank you so much. If you'd like to learn more about Tyson's book, you can visit harpercollins.com for more information on Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. Sand Talk is also available Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers, and if it's not on the shelf, you can ask for them to order it. Also, Sand Talk is available in Kindle. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.